Hey everybody, we're back. And today we're thinking about electoral rules again. We're continuing our discussion that we started last time when we tried to allocate seats to votes and thought about this crazy, setup where we had three parties trying to compete in a little fake country to determine whether dogs, guinea pigs, or cats were going to get the most representation. And I hope that you really thought carefully about how these specific rules actually help to dictate the strategy of voters and the strategy of candidates in terms of the kinds of sort of parties that they were willing to form and the kinds of parties that they're willing to support. Of course, we can't talk about electoral rules in the United States without talking about an even weirder, even more important set of sort of electoral institutions. And of course, that is the Electoral College. So today we'll be talking a little bit about that institution, where it came from, what its sort of weird properties are, and what some possible alternatives might be as well, given that, of course, in the last video we were thinking so hard about all the different possibilities for electoral institutions. And so, when we think about the Electoral College, we can go back to the Federalists again, right? Those framers of the Constitution who were so concerned and worried about this problem of mobocracy, and so afraid essentially of direct democracy and the idea that that might cause elections to essentially devolve into chaos. And it might surprise you actually to think about the framers of the Constitution, who we consider to be these highly democratically oriented people who were working against a monarchy in Great Britain, actually decided that we were not going to directly elect our president. And in fact, if we go back to the earliest record of American voting, we can actually see that it turns out that in many states, the president was actually not an office that was even voted for at all by many voters across the states. And so, in fact, there was one early proposal for presidents to be elected specifically just by Congress, again, in order to cool the passions of the electorate. Again, framers of the Constitution, especially the Federalists, were a little worried about the electorate. They didn't really trust the electorate. And you have to imagine that part of that rationale was that they didn't have a lot of examples to go off of in terms of functioning democracies. And the worry essentially was that pure democracy or democracy that really emphasized this principle of one person, one vote was inherently unstable. And so they sought as much as possible to build in these kind of safeguards to prevent basically popular votes from occurring. So fast forward 200 plus years, and I think we have a very different conception of how democracy is supposed to function, especially if we go back and think about writers like Robert Dahl, who are thinking about what democracy really is at its core. We see that actually the kind of mentality that they had, more than 200 years ago is actually quite different than the way that we think about elections today. And in fact, American history is to some extent a long, slow sort of process towards an accretion of kind of democratic principles in our country. We're actually not really the same political institution that we were in the 1790s. And so we'll actually see some examples, we talk about the Electoral College, of how this system has evolved over time to become increasingly democratic. And so the Electoral College really, again, is this kind of compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It's designed ultimately to insulate the popular vote from the presidency and the presidency from the popular vote. And so if we look at Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, it's written that each state shall appoint, and this is the pivotal point here in terms of explaining and unlocking the weirdness of the Electoral College today, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, blah, blah, blah. What this means is each state gets to pick how they will determine these electors who will go and cast ballots for the president, okay? So again, when we go to the polls today, we go to the polls in 2020, or maybe you've already gone to the polls in 2020, you cast a ballot. That ballot is not actually being counted up and being sent to some central agency to determine who the president is. In fact, what we're actually voting for is for Maryland's delegation of electors to the Electoral College. That's who we're actually voting for, weirdly, right? Essentially, what Article 2, Section 1 says is that the states get the ability to determine how this works. But we set up an election of some kind, or as we'll see in a moment, some other vehicle for determining a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. And so if you think about Maryland today, we've got, of course, 2 senators, just like every other state has, and we have 8 representatives, which means that in this bizarre system, we get 10 votes towards the Electoral College. We get 538 total in America, and 270 of them to win the election to become president of the United States. So Maryland, out of that 538, is contributing 10. So again, we have to parse this, right? To go back and parse this first part of Article 2, Section 1, we have to go back and think about, some early elections and how this actually worked. And so in the election of 1796, we had, sort of, again, one of the first test runs, the test drive of the Constitution, where we had John Adams, who's a Federalist from Massachusetts, against Thomas Jefferson, obviously a Virginian of the Democratic Republicans. For the first time, we have sort of these factions emerging and these different parties kind of going against each other in American politics. And so, of course, in this very important election where the 2 factions of the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists are going head to head, each state chose electors and, again, according to Article 2, Section 1, sent those electors to go cast their ballots for the presidency. But critically, those states did not all use the same rules to determine how those electors were chosen. And let's go back to Article 2, Section 1. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. So the state legislatures got a chance, based on the Constitution, to choose how the electors would be chosen. And so in states like Connecticut, states like Delaware, New Jersey, and New York, electors actually were just picked by the state legislature themselves. They didn't have a vote at all. And so think about this. This is one of the first elections in American history in all these states, important states, right? States like New Jersey, New York, right? Nobody voted for president at all. There was no such thing as a vote for president. In fact, we just had an appointment by the state legislature. The state legislature got together and they voted. And the rationale there was, well, voters already chose the state legislature, so they've given us essentially a mandate to be able to pick for ourselves. In other states, what we had was a system where each congressional district got a chance to vote for one elector, and then we had essentially those congressional districts would come together and form the total of the electors. So Virginia, North Carolina, actually Maryland was a state in which if you were in District 1, for example, or District 2, which however many districts there were at the time in the state of Maryland, you were essentially voting together with your fellow district residents for a single elector. And that single elector would then go and cast their ballot. So we didn't have essentially all of the electors agreeing across the state for who would actually win the president. In fact, if we look at this system in 1796, it's actually only the tiny state of New Hampshire that had a quasi-statewide system in which there was a ballot cast for all the electors at once. Of course, today, generally, almost every state has this statewide system where we tally up all the votes of a single state, and that state either turns red or blue, as you've probably seen in a variety of maps, to determine all of the electoral votes for that state. So there's a couple of states in which that's not the case, Nebraska and Maine, in which they still rely on this individual congressional district method for determining the allocation of a couple of these electors. But in 2018, and as we'll see in 2020, almost every state employs a statewide popular winner-take-all method of choosing electors. So this essentially took place over time as various states started to sort of look across at each other and say, hey, we'd like to do this a little more democratically. We don't think that it's very fair to let just the state legislature choose who our delegation to the Electoral College is going to be. We'd actually like to let voters make this decision. And so as they looked, they kind of cheated on each other's homework a little bit, and they saw that more and more popularly, states were doing this statewide method, where essentially, again, we tally up all the votes in the state, we count them up, and again, first past the post, whichever candidate gets the highest number of votes, even if that's not a majority, they get all of the electoral votes of that state. Again, only Maine and Nebraska are the exceptions to that rule. So another question that we might think of as we're thinking about those 10 people that are going to eventually go to Washington and actually cast ballots for the president, who are these people, right? And again, when we're voting for these candidates, you'll see on your ballot, you'll see that you basically have a choice between, the Republican candidates for president and vice president. You have the choice of the Democratic candidates, Republican and vice president, for president and vice president. And then, depending on ballot access rules in your state, you might have a variety of other third party or minor party or independent candidates that are running on tickets for the presidency as well. Essentially, when we're voting, we actually fill in that bubble and we cast our vote for the Democratic ticket or the Republican ticket or whichever ticket. What you're actually doing is you're voting to allow the party of the state of Maryland to choose the specific electors that are going to go to Washington and cast their ballots for the candidate in the majority. So basically, in Maryland, it's generally a pretty foregone conclusion. We're a pretty blue state, as you might already know. And so most likely, 99.99% likelihood, in the 2020 election, the state will go blue, and then the Democratic Party of the state of Maryland will get a chance to choose those 10 people to go to Washington to cast ballots for the Democratic candidate. And so it can actually be pretty hard, and I think parties try to keep this a little bit on the down low until after elections are over. It's very hard to figure out who actually are those people, partially because I think they want to keep them out of the public eye so they don't get harassed or they don't get annoyed by people trying to, get in their face after the election or something. But you can generally ask the party of the state, who these people are, and they'd be able to tell you. But I know many of you are probably thinking about this. This is a really important responsibility, is it not? And so these 10 people who are, again, real, actual American citizens, who, again, are chosen by, in our case, most likely the Democratic Party to carry those 10 blue votes to Washington to cast them in the Electoral College of the 538, we can be pretty assured that these individuals are not going to reverse their commitment and cast their ballot for another candidate. So I know you probably heard about this idea of a faithless elector. Okay, in many cases, actually, being a faithless elector, that is casting your ballot for a candidate other than the statewide winner, actually, it's illegal to do that. So in Maryland, for example, these people are actually would be fined quite heavily for being a faithless elector and casting their vote for somebody else. Nevertheless, it still does occasionally happen. And really, the takeaway that you need to remember is that these faithless electors are extraordinarily unlikely to influence the actual outcome of the election. And that is because we've essentially never had a case in which a faithless elector has done so in a state where the margin hangs in the balance. Usually these are essentially protest votes that are being cast because the person just finds the winning candidate to be unpalatable. And it's generally they'll cast these votes far after the fact, right after everyone knows who's won the election. And again, it does not affect the outcome. So faithless electors, we can be essentially unperturbed or unworried about the possibility that faithless electors are going to swing the election. It's never happened, and it's extraordinarily unlikely to have any impact on the 2020 presidential election. Again, we also have to remember the fact that these electors, the non-faithless electors, the faithful electors, they're faithful because they've been chosen by their specific political party. And so if you imagine, these people have probably worked tirelessly to advance the goals of their political party over decades, right? These are generally older people. They've worked really hard to get to this position. And they're being rewarded by their party to have this great honor of carrying this electoral vote to Congress to cast it. And so if you think about it, right, what would be the incentive for a lifelong Democrat in Maryland to cast their vote against the Democratic candidate for president if Maryland goes blue? And why would, let's say that, for example, a state like Idaho goes red, why would a lifelong faithful Republican choose to cast their ballot against the Republican candidate? It seems a little far-fetched, and usually, again, these votes are cast if there's somebody who wants to make this esoteric sort of political statement. And you have to remember that they also will get quite heavily sanctioned by their own party, because the party has chosen them with the express goal that they're going to cast a faithful vote. So this is why faithless electors are very rare and are generally not going to affect any kind of real material outcomes. So the statewide voting method, again, as we said, different states went, across time, and they sort of cribbed each other's notes. They looked across after Jacksonian democracy kind of emerged, and this opening of the sort of font of greater emphasis on sort of ballot casting and sort of the democratic principles of our society. Right. This was kind of a historical accident, though. Right. The fact that this statewide vote method out of all the other possible votes, like the method that's being practiced today in Nebraska and Maine, right? This kind of accident is actually an unfortunate historical precedent because it ends up creating disproportionality in the Electoral College. And by that I mean it changes how much your vote counts. Okay, so this is actually a pretty important concept. There's several layers to it, though, right? The first issue is this question of malapportionment. So by malapportionment, essentially what I mean is that state populations are quite different in the United States today. And the electoral vote rules in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution essentially indicate that the actual number of electors that are chosen depends on the number of senators plus the number of representatives. And so that idea of you get 2 plus some number actually creates disproportionality in terms of the relative impact of different states. And so as we said before, we've got 538 votes total in the Electoral College today. DC also counts too, thanks to the 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution. But again, if we think about this, right, if we look at a state like Wyoming, they get 3 electoral votes because they have one single congressional district. They get 1 congressperson because there's a very small number of people who live in Wyoming, less than the number of people who live in the tiny little 10 square mile area of Baltimore City alone, right? So this very small population, they get 1 representative in the House of Representatives based on their tiny population, but they get 2 senators. And so the disproportionality of the Senate means that they actually get 3 electoral votes, even though they really, if we look at the actual proportionality of the population, should get 1 electoral vote. They get 3 times the representation in the Electoral College than they should otherwise. And so I think this is well illustrated by a map. So I've got here the 2012 electoral vote just for illustration. We've got here, you can see that basically this is very similar to that little thing that we played earlier with the guinea pigs, the cats, and the dogs, where we've got these squares. And every square in this map, again, this is a very weird looking map of the United States. Every square in this map is essentially 1 electoral vote. And so you can see that basically the sizes of these states in terms of the area represented by these squares is actually the size of the delegation of the Electoral College that each state gets. And so again, think about the difference between the size of the land that exists in these different states and then the size of the squares that essentially mean representation in choosing the presidency. And so we've got, a state like North Carolina here. They've tried to make them sort of shaped like the states. It's a little hard to see. Maryland here has got these squares, right? We've got 10 squares. Here's DC, right? They get their 3 on the basis of the 23rd Amendment. Delaware here gets 3. Again, Delaware has a tiny, tiny, tiny population, but they still get 3 here. And then again, let's go back over here to some of these plain states, right? Wyoming with their 3 electoral votes, Idaho, etc. Now, what I'd like to do is, I don't want to compare this again to the size of these states geographically, because again, land doesn't vote, right? Populations vote for presidents. If we were to compare this to the actual population of these states, again, looking at 2012 in this particular example, we'll see that even more changes to the actual size of the states occurs. And so this is actually a population scaled kind of bubble map of the population of the US as it looked in 2012. And so you can see here that a state like Wyoming, right, it's about the size of the little hand on my cursor, right? If we go back, we can see it comparatively, we really get to see the tripling of representation in Wyoming compared to the population that's only about the size of 1 square in that Electoral College map. Similarly, Delaware here is quite small in terms, it's a little bit hard to tell generally because they've got this water here. But this is a very, very small strip of land, essentially in terms of its population proportionality. Comparing the map here, though, we see that they get this much thicker sort of 3 as well. And then again, compare some of these large states, right? Large states like California, comparatively, right, they're actually being brought down a little bit in terms of their ability to contribute to the Electoral College relative to their populations. New York, similarly, Florida, actually a very populous state in 2020 or in 2012 as well. actually being slightly undercounted relative to some of these smaller states with small populations. West Virginia, for example, 5 electoral votes. You can see here it's shrunken. It's much smaller than those 5. And that comes again because the rules of the Electoral College give some of these tiny states a bonus sort of 2 votes on the basis of their Senate delegation. So this is one of the issues. Another issue is this idea of partisan imbalance. And again, this is perhaps a much bigger problem than this question of disproportionality based on population. And that is this idea that voters essentially have managed to gerrymander themselves by moving from state to state. And so again, like a very blue state like California has an extraordinarily large population. But again, when we think about these blue and red states, we think about the swinginess or the degree to which these states are competitive. Only a few states in the United States, right? If in 2020, we're thinking about states like Pennsylvania, states like North Carolina and Florida and Michigan, perhaps Wisconsin. These are really the only states for which there's a tremendous amount of parity in terms of the density of Republicans and Democrats in the actual body of voters. In many other states, if we think about a state like Texas or a state like California or a state like New York, a state like Illinois, perhaps, other deep red states as well. So think about a state like Louisiana, a state like Arkansas, a state like Missouri. Right? These states have far and away way more Republicans than they do Democrats. And in these states, there are far away way more Democrats than there are Republicans. Right? In a state like Maryland, for example, right, has about 10 to 15% more Democrats, consistent, loyal Democrats than they do consistent, loyal Republicans. And as a result, these states become extraordinarily non-competitive. And essentially, if the population were more evenly distributed across the country, then we might have more competitive elections. But instead, these partisan imbalances mean that only a few states actually become pivotal in determining the outcome. And so as we sort of wrap up our discussion of the Electoral College today, what I'd like you to really think about, right, is what are some potential alternatives to the Electoral College? Do we think these alternatives are fairer, and on what sort of basis might we think that these rules are more fair? And then again, the last question that I think we should ask ourselves is, are there any reasons why we should change the rules? Are there any potential explanations for why we should not change those rules? Again, really thinking about the idea that what we have in America today are really a set of institutions that were created with a long historical sort of precedent that were created almost haphazardly by the individuals who were operating under very different circumstances and assumptions at the time. Nevertheless, these are the rules that we're stuck with today. And if we think about how elections are run today, we can really, I think, critically evaluate whether we like them, whether we dislike them. And I think one thing that I especially encourage you to think about is to try to reason through these choices not on the basis of your own partisanship, right? Because I think, today there's a lot of criticism of the Electoral College on the left, and there's a lot of, support for the Electoral College on the right. It's not really the case, though, that the Electoral College actually always produces like redder elections or something like that, okay? It's actually the case that the Electoral College introduces a lot of randomness and a lot of disproportionality, essentially, into these elections. Not only that, but it also means that states like Maryland are essentially non-competitive and not interesting from the perspective of presidential elections in the first place. And so, again, I really think take off your partisan hat and think about these rules, right? What is the principle of fairness, the principle of proportionality, the principle of one person, one vote, and how might changes to these rules, even slight changes, help to reduce the degree to which these elections that we have today are the product of like very small scale, like random fluctuations in voting and electoral activity. I need not mention the election of the year 2000 to give you a sort of an indication of an example where an entire presidential election across all 50 states hung, essentially in the balance of a few thousand votes in one county in the state of Florida. If you don't know much about election 2000, give that a look. It's not that long ago. I remember very vividly living through that moment. And so I encourage you to take a look at that and continue thinking critically about this phenomenon of the Electoral College, what it does, what it doesn't do, and how we might be able to reform it in the future. Have a wonderful week, everyone, and good luck on the midterm exam.